Have you ever noticed that an idea gets bigger at night? Not a worry. Worries are small and specific, and they gnaw. This is the other thing. The thought that arrives with a sense of scale attached and keeps growing in the quiet, and by 3 in the morning has become the most important thing you have ever understood. And then at 9, over something to drink, it is merely interesting. Nothing changed except the room. During the day, you are among people with ideas of their own, and interruptions and small humiliations, all of which act on a large thought like sandpaper. At this hour, there is nothing in the room but you and the thing you are carrying, and it has no opposition at all. Tonight, we sit with 2 men who went a very long way down that road, one of whom came back. In May of 1934, in Zurich, Carl Gustav Jung began reading one book out loud to a small group, a few pages at a time. He kept doing it for 5 years and never reached the end. The book was Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and he believed it had destroyed the man who wrote it. Chapter 1. The thought that gets too big. Begin with why this might matter to you at 1 in the morning. There is a particular kind of thought that is not a worry. A worry is small and specific and gnawing. This is the opposite. This is the thought that arrives with a sense of scale attached, and the scale is the problem. It might be an idea about what you should be doing with your life. It might be a conviction about a person or a project or a wrong that was done to you or a thing you have understood about the world that other people have not. It might be a belief. It might be a plan. The signature of it is not that it is wrong. It very often is not wrong. The signature is that it has stopped being something you have and started being something you are. And you can tell because of what happens when it is questioned. If somebody disagrees with the thought you have, you can consider it. If somebody disagrees with the thought you have become, the experience is not intellectual. It is an attack, and it feels like one in the body. That is the subject of tonight, and it has a name, and the man in the room in Zurich gave it that name. There is a further feature of this kind of thought, and it is the one that makes it hard to talk about. It is usually correct about something. That is what separates it from a delusion and what makes it so difficult to put down. The grievance is about a real injury. The idea about your work is genuinely a good idea. The thing you have noticed about the people around you is quite often actually there. So every attempt to deal with it by arguing against the content fails immediately, and fails in a way that makes you more certain because you have just successfully defended it. Which means the question tonight cannot be whether the thought is true. We are not going to settle that, and I have no way of knowing. The question is only what shape your relationship to it has, and that is a completely separate matter, and it is one you can inspect in the dark without any new information. Let your shoulders drop. Let the weight of you settle. There is nothing to decide in the next 3 hours, and nothing in this asks anything of you. One more thing about scale before we start. The thought does not announce that it has grown. There is no moment at which you notice the transition, because the thing doing the noticing is the thing that has changed size. What you notice instead is the world getting smaller. Other people become less interesting. Conversations that do not touch the subject feel like an imposition. Books you used to like seem thin. That is the reliable early signal. And it is external rather than internal, which is why it is worth knowing. Not the idea feeling bigger, but everything else feeling flatter. It is worth saying who this evening is likely to be for. Not people in the grip of something obvious. If an idea has taken over your life to the point that other people have started saying so, this is not the recording that helps, and there is a chapter near the end that says what does. This is for the much larger group who have one thing they think about more than they would admit. A conviction about how they were treated, a plan they have never started, a theory about their own family, a thing they understood once that nobody else seems to have understood. It sits there most of the time, and then the house goes quiet and it stands up. Chapter 2, Having and Being. Let me draw the distinction as clearly as I can, because the whole evening rests on it. Consider a thought you are merely holding. You can turn it over. You can say, I think this, and also, I might be wrong about this, in the same breath, without discomfort. You can put it down and pick it up again. Other people can hold different ones, and you are not diminished. Now consider a thought that has moved. You cannot say, I might be wrong about this, without something rising in you. You find yourself defending it in conversations where nobody attacked it. It arrives uninvited in the middle of unrelated things. It has begun to explain more and more until quite a lot of your life is organized around it. And crucially, if it turned out to be false, the question would not be what to do next. The question would be who you are. The second one is the dangerous arrangement. And the danger is not the content of the idea. You can arrive here through a religion or through the loss of one, through a political conviction, through a diagnosis, through a grievance, which is the most common of all, through a vocation, through love, through an idea about your own specialness or an idea about your own worthlessness, both of which behave identically. The content is almost irrelevant. What matters is whether there is still somebody standing next to it. There is a third position that is worth naming, because most people assume there are only two. You can hold an idea seriously without being it. The two available options usually seem to be belief, in which the thing is true and you organize around it, and skepticism, in which you hold it at arm's length and never really commit to anything. And a great deal of adult disappointment comes from oscillating between those, because the first eventually costs you your judgment, and the second eventually costs you your life. The third position is the one this whole evening is about, and it is the one the man in the room in Zurich spent 40 years describing. You take the thing entirely seriously. You give it your attention and your hours. And you remain, throughout, a separate object from it, capable of saying that you might be wrong without anything rising in your chest. That is not a compromise between the two. It is a different arrangement, and it is harder than either. And it is the only one that survives contact with an idea large enough to matter. It is worth adding that this can happen with something entirely benign: a vocation, a person you love, a child, a cause that is genuinely good and genuinely urgent. Nothing about the mechanism requires the content to be dark or false. Some of the most complete cases of a person being swallowed involve things that everybody around them approves of, which is precisely why nobody intervenes. The test is not whether other people think the idea is good. It is whether there is still somebody in there who could be wrong about it. There is one more reason the distinction matters, and it is about other people. An idea you hold can be shared. You can put it down in front of somebody and they can pick it up, examine it, hand it back with a mark on it, and you are both still there. An idea you have become cannot be shared, only submitted to or resisted. Anybody you tell has to either join or become an opponent, and there is no third option available to them, which is why this arrangement is so isolating, and why the isolation deepens the arrangement. Fewer people can talk to you about it, so there is less friction, so it grows, so fewer people can talk to you about it. Chapter 3. Why this is a night subject, and what this evening is not. There is a reason we are doing this at 1 in the morning rather than at 4 in the afternoon. At 4 in the afternoon, there is friction. You are among people who have their own ideas and things that need doing and interruptions and small humiliations, all of which act on a large thought like sandpaper. The world is constantly, gently, telling you the size of yourself. At 1 in the morning, all of that is switched off. There is nothing in the room but you and whatever you are carrying, and the thing you are carrying has no opposition, which is exactly the condition under which an idea grows. Everybody knows this from the inside. The plan that seemed enormous at 2 in the morning and ordinary at 9, the certainty about a person that was total at 3 and merely arguable at breakfast. The message you were sure you had to send. That is not you being irrational at night. It is that an idea in an empty room expands to fill it, and at 1 in the morning, the room is empty. 2 cautions before we begin, and I want to give them properly. The first is that nobody in this recording is being diagnosed. Nietzsche's collapse in January 1889 has at least 4 competing medical explanations. The field has not settled it, and I will give you all 4 later and decline to choose between them. Jung's opinion about it was formed in 1934 by a man with a theory of his own to advance, and I will say so at the time. The second is about the material itself. Nietzsche is one of the most misrepresented writers who has ever lived, in both directions. He has been claimed by people he would have despised and dismissed by people who have not read him. Some of that is his own fault, because he wrote in a deliberately provocative and aphoristic style that is very easy to quote out of context. Some of it is not his fault at all, and is the work of one specific person who we will get to. I am going to keep to what is documented, note where it is contested, and stay out of the arguments that do not belong in a recording made to help people sleep. A third caution, which is about me rather than about the material. I am going to give you Jung's reading of Nietzsche at some length tonight, because it is genuinely interesting, and because it is the reason the seminar exists. I do not entirely believe it. I will say why when we get there, and I will give you the objections properly rather than as a token gesture. But I want to flag now that the centerpiece of tonight's argument is one man's interpretation of another man made 45 years after the fact, by somebody with a theory to advance and a personal stake in the answer. That is not a reason to ignore it. It is a reason to hold it the way you would hold any account given by an interested party, as evidence about the person giving it as much as about the person described, which is, as it happens, exactly the skill the whole episode is about. One last thing before the story, and it is about the register. There is a way of talking about Nietzsche that is all thunder, and a way of talking about Jung that is all reverence, and I am going to avoid both. Two men, both difficult, both wrong about a great deal, both worth 3 hours. One of them ended badly and the other did not, and the difference is more mundane and more useful than either of their admirers would like. Chapter 4. A student who would not read a book. Start with Jung, because he is the one who arrives at the story sideways. In the second half of the 1890s, he was a medical student at Basel. He was poor. His father, a pastor, had died in 1896 when Jung was 21, and there was very little money. He worked, he read enormously, and he was known among his fellow students as a talker. And in that period he did something odd, which he described 60 years later. He knew about Zarathustra. Everybody at Basel knew about it, and he deliberately did not read it for years because he was afraid of it. He had read Goethe's Faust as a boy, and it had gone into him at a depth that unsettled him. And he had picked up from the atmosphere around Nietzsche's name in that city the sense that this was a book of the same order and possibly worse. He was 23 when he finally read it. I want you to notice the specific move, because it is uncharacteristic of how we usually think about clever young men. He was not afraid the book would be bad. He was afraid it would be true, and that it would take him somewhere he could not get back from. That is a person with an accurate sense of his own susceptibility at 23, which is not a common possession. It is worth adding what else was going on in that young man's life, because it makes the fear less abstract. His father had died the year before of an illness nobody could name after a long decline. His mother had been in and out of a psychiatric hospital during his childhood. The household he grew up in had, by his own later account, an atmosphere in which things were felt and never said. And in the middle of his student years, he had spent 2 years running a series of seances with a young cousin, which he wrote up as his doctoral dissertation. That dissertation is a real document, and it is worth knowing about because it establishes something about him at 25. He did not approach the material as a believer. He approached it as an observer, took careful notes, and produced a psychological explanation for what he had seen. So the man who read Zarathustra at 23 and was frightened by it was not a mystical young man looking for confirmation. He was somebody who had already watched a mind produce material it did not know it was producing, had close quarters in his own family, and who had reason to think he might be susceptible to the same thing. It is worth adding one small thing about the timing of that fear. He put the book off for years and then read it at 23, which is to say he read it at almost exactly the age at which the man who wrote it was appointed to a chair at the same university. I do not want to make anything of that. It is a coincidence, and this whole evening has been about not making things of coincidences. But it does mean that the young man reading Zarathustra in Basel was reading it at the age his predecessor had been, when everything was still ahead of him in the same town, and I suspect he noticed. It is worth knowing what he did with the seances afterwards, because it is the first appearance of a habit he kept for 60 years. He did not conclude that the phenomena were real, and he did not conclude that his cousin was a fraud. He concluded that a young woman had produced, in an altered state, a set of characters and a language and a cosmology, none of which she could account for, and that this was an extraordinary fact about ordinary minds, regardless of where the material came from. That is the move he makes every time. Refuse both the credulous reading and the dismissive one, and insists that the production itself is the interesting object. It is a genuinely good instinct, and it is the reason his work survived, and it is also the reason he sometimes cannot see a literary device when one is in front of him. Chapter 5. What Nietzsche was in that city. You have to understand that in Basel in the 1890s, Nietzsche was not a distant literary figure. He was local, recent, and scandalous. He had been professor of classical philology at the University of Basel from 1869 to 1879. He had lived in the town for a decade. There were people still teaching there who had been his colleagues. There were people in the street who had known him. And what everybody in Basel also knew was how it had ended. That the brilliant young professor had left because of his health, had spent 10 years wandering, had written a series of increasingly strange books that nobody bought, and had then, in January 1889, in Turin, gone irretrievably mad in public, and was at that moment still alive in his mother's house and later his sister's, being displayed to visitors like a relic. That was the atmosphere in which a 23-year-old medical student picked up the book. Jung said later that among the students there was a particular young man, an aristocratic, precious, affected sort of figure who was regarded as slightly ridiculous, and that this young man's connection to Nietzsche was part of what made him wary. He was worried about being that kind of person. He was worried that taking Nietzsche seriously was itself a symptom. There is something very ordinary and very human in that, and it is the last ordinary thing in the story for a while. There is one detail about that city and that decade that makes the whole thing sharper. Nietzsche was, at the moment Jung was reading him, still alive. Not a historical figure. Not a dead philosopher whose collapse could be considered at a comfortable distance. A living man in a house in Weimar, being cared for by his sister, occasionally displayed to visitors, incapable of speech. The man who wrote the book was in a room somewhere and had been for 8 years and would be for 2 more. That changes what reading Zarathustra was like for a 23-year-old in Basel. It was not an encounter with a body of work. It was an encounter with a body of work whose author was visibly, currently, and permanently gone, and about whom everybody in that city had an opinion. If you want to know why Jung took the question of what happens to a mind under this kind of pressure quite so personally, and why he was still working on it 40 years later, that is a large part of the answer. There is one more thing about that atmosphere that is worth knowing. By the late 1890s, the Nietzsche legend was already being manufactured, and it was being manufactured by his sister, who had returned from Paraguay and had begun receiving visitors. So the version circulating in Basel while Jung was a student was not a neutral account. It was an early draft of the myth, with the dramatic collapse foregrounded and the 20 years of ordinary illness left out. Which means Jung's formative impression of the case was shaped by publicity, and he spent the rest of his life working with an image that had been arranged for him before he ever opened the book. It is worth adding what the students in that city actually did. with the name. They used it as a posture. There was a recognizable type in the 1890s. The young man who had read a little Nietzsche and had adopted the vocabulary of hardness and the contempt for the herd, and who was, in almost every case, a perfectly conventional person wearing an attitude. Jung was allergic to it and said so, and there is something slightly comic in a young man avoiding a book for years, partly out of a fear of looking like the sort of person who has read it. Almost everybody has declined something worthwhile for exactly that reason. One more thing about that city and that decade. Basel was small, conservative and Protestant, and a professor there was a public figure whose conduct was noticed. Which is worth knowing about both men. Nietzsche spent 10 years being conspicuous in a town that watched him and left it as an invalid at 34. Jung arrived as a poor student a decade later in the same streets, in a family that had lost its standing and was extremely conscious of being watched. Neither of them was operating in the anonymity that a large city gives you, and a certain amount of what both of them wrote about the crowd and the herd was written by men who had never been able to disappear into one. Chapter 6. The Pastor's Son. Now Nietzsche, from the beginning, and told plainly, he was born in October 1844 in a village in Saxony. His father was a Lutheran pastor. His grandfathers on both sides were Lutheran clergy. It was, in other words, exactly the sort of household that produces either a bishop or a demolition expert. When he was 4, his father became ill. The illness affected his brain. The family called it a softening of the brain, and modern accounts are uncertain what it was. He was ill for about a year, with headaches, deteriorating sight, and periods of incapacity, and he died in July 1849 at 35. 6 months later, Nietzsche's younger brother, aged 2, also died. So by the age of 5, he had lost his father and his brother, and he moved with his mother, his grandmother, 2 aunts and his sister into a house in Naumburg, where he was the only male in a household of 5 women. He was, by every account, an extraordinarily serious child. He wrote poems and composed music. He kept records of his own life. At school, he was known for an almost oppressive gravity. I am going to set down those facts and then decline to do anything with them, because the temptation to run the father's illness forward 40 years into January 1889 is enormous, and the evidence for it is not what it appears. We will come back to that when we get to Turin. It is worth pausing on that household because it produced something specific. He was the only male in a house of 5 women, in a small town, in a family whose entire standing rested on religious respectability. And what everybody who knew him as a boy reports is that he was preternaturally well behaved, serious, correct, reverent. The other boys called him the little pastor, and the accounts suggest it was not entirely affectionate. That is worth holding on to when you get to the later work, which is one long assault on exactly that, on duty, on meekness, on the morality of the well-behaved, on the idea that restraint is a virtue rather than a symptom. I am not going to run that backwards into a psychological explanation of his philosophy, because that is precisely the move Jung makes, and I have already said I do not entirely trust it. But it is worth noticing, and it is worth noticing in your own case too, The thing a person spends their life arguing against is very often the thing they were made of, and that does not make the argument wrong. Some of the best criticism of anything comes from somebody who was raised inside it. It is worth noticing what he did with the household later in print. He almost never mentions it. For a writer who examined his own formation exhaustively and who was perfectly willing to be indiscreet about other people, the near total silence about his mother and sister in the published work is conspicuous. The one substantial exception is the late material about Elizabeth's husband, which is furious. Silence of that kind is not evidence of anything in particular. But it is worth registering, because we are about to spend several chapters on a man who claimed to be able to read a mind from its productions, and the productions here have a hole in them. It is worth adding one fact about the household that changes the tone of everything after. The father did not simply die. He deteriorated at home over the better part of a year, with headaches and failing sight and periods in which he was not himself in front of a 4-year-old. And then the little brother died 6 months later. I said earlier I would not run that forward into an explanation of the philosophy, and I am not going to. But it belongs in the record as fact rather than as interpretation, because a boy who watched a mind go in his own house before he was 5, and who then spent his adult life with headaches and failing sight, was living with a question that most people never have to hold. Chapter 7. A professor at 24. He went to Bonn, then to Leipzig, to study classical philology, which was then one of the most rigorous disciplines in German academic life. And he was, by common consent, the outstanding student of his generation. His work was so good that in 1869, when the chair at Basel came open, the University of Leipzig awarded him a doctorate without examination or dissertation on the strength of his published articles, and Basel appointed him. He was 24 years old. He had not completed a doctoral thesis. He was, and I believe remains, one of the youngest people ever appointed to a full professorship in that field. Consider what that does to a person. At 24, he was told by the most serious institutions available that he was exceptional. Not promising, exceptional. And he had every reason to believe it, because it was true. Then, in 1872, he published his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, and the reaction from his own profession was severe. A young philologist named Wilamowitz, who would go on to be the dominant classicist of the age, published an attack on it that was close to career-ending. The book was judged unscholarly. Nietzsche's lecture courses at Basel emptied, so by 28, the pattern of his whole life was already set. Recognized as exceptional, then repudiated by the people whose recognition had defined him, and left holding an idea that he was increasingly alone with. There is a specific quality to that kind of early recognition that is worth naming, because it is not the advantage it sounds like. Being told at 24 that you are exceptional gives you something enormously valuable, and it takes something away. What it gives is obvious: standing, confidence, access, the ability to work on hard things without asking permission. What it takes is the ordinary calibration that everybody else spends their 20s acquiring. Most people learn, slowly and unpleasantly, roughly how good they are, by being wrong in public a number of times and surviving it. That process is miserable and it produces a durable sense of scale. He never had it. He went from being the outstanding student to being a professor without the intervening decade, and then, at 28, was repudiated by his entire profession in a single stroke. So he had the maximum possible confirmation and then the maximum possible rejection, with nothing in between and no calibrated middle to fall back on. That is a genuinely difficult position, and it is not rare. Anybody who was told early that they were the clever one and then met the first thing they could not do knows the specific vertigo of it. There is a small detail from the Basel years that is worth having, because it complicates the picture of a man who could not cope with rejection. He kept teaching for another 7 years. After the book was attacked and the lecture rooms emptied, he did not resign in protest and he did not collapse. He went on lecturing on Greek literature, badly attended, to a diminished audience for the better part of a decade, until his body made it impossible. That is not the behavior of somebody who could not tolerate humiliation. It is the behavior of somebody grinding out a job in reduced circumstances. It is worth adding one more fact about that appointment, because it is the detail that makes the rest of the life legible. He was not merely young. He was appointed, without a doctorate, on the recommendation of a teacher, to a chair in the most rigorous discipline in German academic life, at an age when his contemporaries were still students. Which means his entire adult identity was established by other people's assessment of him before he had produced anything, and was then withdrawn by other people's assessment 3 years later on the strength of one book. Neither event was really about the work. Both were about how a profession decided to regard him, and both happened before he was 30. A person formed that way has no independent measure of their own worth to fall back on, because the measure was always external and it has already swung wildly in both directions. Chapter 8. The Body and 10 Years of Rooms. You cannot understand what happened to him without the illness, and the illness is usually mentioned in a sentence and then dropped. From his mid-20s, he had violent headaches lasting for days, severe eye pain and rapidly deteriorating vision, and prolonged bouts of vomiting. The attacks came without warning and put him out of action completely. In 1879, 1 year, he recorded something like 118 days of incapacity. That is a third of the year in which he could do nothing at all. At 34, he resigned the chair at Basel on medical grounds and was granted a small pension. And here is the thing that gets lost. For the next 10 years, everything he wrote in the gaps between attacks. Largely unable to read for extended periods, often unable to bear light, taking notes in a jerky hand in small notebooks while walking, because walking was the only condition in which he could work. His entire mature output was produced by a man who was ill more often than he was, well, on his own, in rented rooms in his 30s and early 40s. Whatever else is true, the picture of Nietzsche as a man drunk on his own power is very hard to square with the daily reality, which was closer to a man rationing an unreliable body. From 1879 to 1889, he had no fixed home. He moved according to the weather and the state of his head, in a circuit that repeated: the Engadine in the Swiss Alps in the summer, chiefly the village of Sils Maria, the Italian Riviera or Nice in the winter, Genoa, Venice, Turin at the end. The rooms were cheap and small, He ate simply and often badly. He had almost no possessions and moved with a trunk. And he walked 6, 8 hours a day in the mountains or along the sea, thinking with a notebook. There is a detail from this period I find as affecting as anything in it. At Sils Maria, he wrote to friends inviting them to visit, repeatedly, and they largely did not come. He spent Christmas alone more than once. His letters ask, with a kind of careful lightness, that fools nobody, whether anybody might be free. He was not a hermit by disposition. He was a sociable man with an unreliable body, no money, and a book nobody wanted, who ended up alone. That distinction is going to matter later. It is worth being concrete about what the illness actually cost him, because the numbers are more shocking than the description. In 1 year, he recorded well over 100 days of complete incapacity. In many years, the figure was substantial. He described attacks lasting 2 and 3 days at a time, with vomiting, with vision so degraded that he could not read, in rooms he had to keep dark. He wrote almost everything he is known for in the gaps. And it means something specific about the books. They are aphoristic, in short-numbered sections, not because he preferred the form as a literary matter, but because that was the unit of work available to a man who could not count on being able to think tomorrow. The style everybody argues about was, at least partly, a symptom. I find that a useful corrective to a certain romanticism about difficulty. He was not sharpened by it. He worked despite it in the intervals, and the shape of what he produced is the shape of the intervals. It is worth adding what he could still do. He walked 6 to 8 hours a day when he was well enough in the mountains above Sils Maria or along the coast. And the notebooks were filled on those walks, which means that almost the entire body of work was composed while moving, outdoors, alone, and then transcribed later. That is worth registering for its own sake, and it is the one part of his method that is entirely available to anybody. It also happens to be the same discovery Jung made with the stones, that the thinking arrives while the body is occupied and does not arrive at the desk. Chapter 9. How the book was written and how few people read it. Thus Spoke Zarathustra was written in 4 parts, and the composition of it is genuinely unusual. He wrote the first part in about 10 days, in early 1883, in Rapallo. The second part in about 10 days, that summer at Sils Maria. The third in about 10 days at the beginning of 1884 in Nice. 3 bursts of 10 days each, separated by months in which he could barely function. He described the state of it afterwards in terms that are worth quoting the sense of, though not the exact words, because they are the closest thing we have to his own account of the mechanism. He described something arriving with overwhelming force, taking a form he did not choose, with the sense of receiving rather than composing, of being an instrument, and he was explicit that the experience did not feel like authorship. Hold on to that description. When we get to Jung's diagnosis, that passage is the piece of evidence he builds it on. The 4th part was written a year later, and by then he could not find a publisher. He had it privately printed, 40 copies. He gave them to friends, and there were not 40 friends to give them to. The number who actually received one was smaller. I want to be very concrete about the reception. because the modern picture of Nietzsche as an intellectual titan makes the reality almost impossible to imagine. In his own lifetime, he was not famous. His books did not sell. Some of them sold in quantities you could count on your fingers in the first years. On the Genealogy of Morals, now one of the most taught works in the humanities, is reported to have sold in the low tens of copies after publication. He paid for printing himself more than once. Booksellers returned stock. He wrote in a letter that he had not received a single serious review. And then, right at the end, in 1888, it began. A Danish scholar named Georg Brandes gave a lecture course on him in Copenhagen, the first anybody had ever given, and the audience was large. Letters began arriving from strangers. There is a real sense in the last year of the correspondence of a man who can see something coming. He had, at that point, a few months of lucidity left. That is the fact that hangs over the whole of the rest of tonight. He wrote for 10 years, into silence, in pain, alone, at his own expense. Recognition arrived, and he had approximately 1 year to be aware of it, and then it was taken. There is one more fact about the reception that is worth having, and it is the loneliest one. He paid for it himself. Several of the later books were published at his own expense, out of a small pension, by a man who could not afford it because no publisher would take them. He then gave copies away to a list of people he hoped might read them, and most of them did not. And the responses he did get were frequently from people who had misunderstood the books entirely, which he found worse than silence. I want that in view, because there is a very common experience it maps onto, and it has nothing to do with philosophy. The work that nobody asked for. The thing you have been doing for years that no one has ever really engaged with. The project you have paid for out of your own money and sent to people who did not reply. He had 10 years of exactly that, and it is the ordinary condition of most people doing anything original, and the fact that it turned out well for him afterwards is no comfort at all to somebody in the middle of it, because he did not know either. It is worth adding what the silence did to the work itself. Writing into no response for a decade removes the ordinary corrective that publication provides. Nobody argued with him in print. Nobody made him defend a weak passage. The books got stranger and more certain, and there was no mechanism anywhere in his life that would have registered that as a problem. That is not a claim about his mental state. It is a claim about editing. And it is the same structural point we keep arriving at from different directions tonight. Friction is not a courtesy. It is a load-bearing part of thinking, and he had none for 10 years. Chapter 10. What the book is, and the student who finally read it. A word about Zarathustra itself, because you cannot follow Jung's argument without knowing roughly what he was reading. It is not a treatise. It is closer to a scripture, deliberately so. It is written in a high biblical register, in short numbered sections, and it has a protagonist, a figure called Zarathustra, who comes down from a mountain after 10 years alone and begins speaking to people. It parodies the Gospels constantly and knowingly. It has disciples, it has parables, it has a Last Supper. And it contains the ideas everybody has heard of in that form: the overman, the death of God, the eternal recurrence, the will to power. But the thing to hold on to is the form. He did not write an argument for these ideas. He put them in the mouth of a prophet, in the style of scripture, in a book that ends with the prophet leaving, which raises the question that Jung spent 5 years on, and it is a good question. If you are going to say the most important thing you have ever thought, why would you invent a prophet to say it for you? Jung read Zarathustra at 23, having put it off for years, and the effect was what he had feared. He said it gripped him in the way Faust had. He read it through, and what he came out with was not agreement or disagreement, but recognition, which is a different and more dangerous relationship to a book. What he recognized was a division he already knew from the inside. From childhood, Jung had experienced himself as two people. He called them with a flatness that is almost comic, given what he made of everything else, number one and number two. Number one was the schoolboy. The son of a poor country pastor, awkward, bad at mathematics, worried about his clothes, situated exactly in the year and the town he happened to be in. Number two was old. Not a fantasy of being old, a settled sense of being an authoritative adult of a previous century who had access to things number one did not, for whom the world was transparent, and who regarded number one's difficulties as small. He was clear, writing about it in old age, that this was not a disorder and that both were fully himself. But he was equally clear that the arrangement was unstable and that a person could tip into the second one and not come back. So a boy who had lived with that arrangement his whole life picked up a book by a man from his own town and found in it a figure of exactly that kind, speaking with exactly that authority, produced by a man who had subsequently been carried out of a square in Turin. He wrote that he saw in Nietzsche what could happen if number two took over. That is where the 5-year seminar begins, 40 years early. There is a question worth sitting with before we go on, because Jung's entire reading depends on how you answer it. Why would a man who has spent his career writing in the first person, in his own voice, aggressively and personally, suddenly invent a prophet to speak for him? There are at least 3 answers, and they are not exclusive. The literary answer, because the ideas needed a form with authority, and he was parodying scripture deliberately, and you cannot parody scripture in a monograph. The strategic answer, because saying these things in his own voice would have been intolerable, and a character provides distance from your own claims. Writers have used that device forever. And the answer Jung gives. Because the material was not entirely his, arrived in a form he did not choose, and presented itself as something being said to him rather than by him, and the figure is a report of that experience rather than a technique. I do not think we can settle it. But it is worth noticing that the first 2 are ordinary literary choices, and the third is a claim about a mental state, and that Jung reaches for the third without seriously considering the first 2. That is the weak point in his case, and we will come back to it. It is worth adding the detail about the 4th part, because it is the loneliest fact in the story. He had 40 copies printed and could not find 40 people to send them to. The accounts differ on the exact number distributed. It was somewhere between 7 and a dozen. A man privately printing the final part of his major work and then discovering that his list of possible readers runs to single figures is a very specific kind of failure, and he had it at 40, and he had another 5 years of work to do afterwards. Chapter the 11th of August, 1900, and 1905. Nietzsche died on the 25th of August, 1900, in Weimar, at 55, after 11 years of incapacity. Jung was 25. He had just finished his medical studies at Basel. And in December of that same year, he took up a post as an assistant physician at the Burg Holzli, the psychiatric hospital in Zurich, which was then one of the most serious institutions of its kind in Europe. Consider the sequence. A young man is afraid of a book because he suspects it describes a state he is susceptible to. He reads it and confirms it. The author of the book, who spent his last decade unable to speak coherently, dies in August. In December, the young man moves into a psychiatric hospital as staff and spends the next 9 years on wards full of people whose minds have produced material with the same overwhelming authority and no capacity to stand outside it. He said, much later, that he went into psychiatry because it was the one field that took the whole person seriously. That is true, and it is also the sort of thing one says afterwards. Whatever the motive, he spent his 20s in daily contact with the outcome he was afraid of. Now the piece of work that is, in my judgment, the most extraordinary thing in this whole story, and which almost nobody has heard of. In 1905, at 30, Jung published a short paper called Cryptomnesia. He had noticed something while reading Zarathustra. There is a passage in it in which Zarathustra is told a story by sailors, an account of a figure seen on an island, of a shadow going down into a volcano, of the dead being summoned. It is one of the odder passages in a book made of odd passages, and Jung thought he had read it before. He went looking, and he found it in an obscure book published in the 1830s, an annual of ghost stories and psychic curiosities compiled by a physician and poet named Justinus Kerner, called Blätter aus Prevorst. In it, there is an account, presented as a true report from a ship's log, of exactly that scene. Sailors near the volcanic islands off Sicily seeing a figure, recognizing him, watching him go down into the crater. The correspondence between the two passages is not thematic. It is close to word for word, with the phrases in the same order. It is worth noting what Jung was doing in the years immediately after, because it bears on how he read Nietzsche later. He spent 9 years on a locked ward, not as a theorist. As a junior doctor at the Burg Holzli, living on site on a hospital that took the most severely unwell patients in the canton, at a time when there was no effective treatment for any of it. And the thing he became known for there was that he talked to them. The prevailing view at the time was that the speech of psychotic patients was noise, degraded output from a damaged organ of no more interest than a fever. Jung's contribution, and it was a real one, was to take the content seriously enough to look for structure in it and to find some. So when he came much later to read a book that its author described as having arrived rather than been composed, he had 9 years of listening to material that arrived rather than being composed, and a habit of assuming it had structure. That is the lens. It is a genuinely valuable lens, and it also guarantees a particular reading. A man with that training handed Zarathustra was never going to see a literary device. It is worth saying what those 9 years did to Jung's ear. He came out of the Bergholzli able to listen to disordered speech without flinching and without dismissing it, which is a rare and genuinely useful capacity. It also left him with an occupational bias that never really lifted, a tendency to hear any unusual production as material to be interpreted rather than as, say, a choice, a joke, or a style. That bias is the engine of everything valuable he did, and it is also the reason the Nietzsche reading goes wrong. One more note about the Bergholzli years. He lived on the premises for most of them, in staff quarters inside the hospital, which was normal for junior doctors at the time. So, for the better part of a decade, his home and the ward were the same building, and the material he was learning to listen to was audible through the walls at night. That is worth knowing about a man who later insisted, above everything, that what saves a person is having an ordinary life to go back to. Chapter 12. The letter to his sister and what it means. So Jung did the thing that turns an observation into evidence. He wrote to Nietzsche's sister. Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche was by then the controller of her brother's papers and reputation, running an archive in Weimar. Jung wrote and asked whether her brother could have encountered Kerner's book. She replied that they had. She and her brother had read Kerner together as children at their grandfather's house when Nietzsche was somewhere around 12 or 13. That is the confirmation, and it is worth understanding what it establishes. Nietzsche did not steal the passage. There is no question of plagiarism. He had no motive, and the source was obscure to the point of invisibility. He had read something at 12 or 13, forgotten it entirely and completely, and it had sat somewhere in him for 30-odd years, and then, in a state in which he experienced himself as receiving material rather than composing it, it came back up, nearly verbatim, and he wrote it down believing it was his. The word Jung used, cryptomnesia, means hidden memory. It was not his coinage. It came out of the work of Theodore Flournoy in Geneva, who had used it to explain the productions of a medium who spoke what she believed was Martian and which turned out to be a reworking of French. And this small paper is the foundation of Jung's entire career. Everything he later argued about the mind's capacity to store, transform, and return material without the owner's knowledge starts here, with a passage in a book and a letter to a sister. But I want to draw a different conclusion than the one usually drawn, because there is one available that helps you directly. Nietzsche was not lying. He genuinely did not know. His sincerity about the experience of receiving was total, and it was also wrong. Which means the feeling of receiving something from beyond yourself is not evidence about where it came from. That feeling is enormously convincing. It is the feeling that founds religions and inspires art. And it is also the feeling that arrives at 1 a.m, attached to a sentence about your own worthlessness, which presents itself as a truth being revealed to you, rather than as a thought you are having. The internal sense of revelation tells you about the mode of production. It tells you nothing whatever about the source or the truth of the content. It is worth being precise about how thin the evidence for cryptomnesia usually is, because this case is unusually strong and most are not. Ordinarily, when somebody claims that a writer unconsciously reproduced the source, the evidence is thematic. Similar ideas, similar imagery, a shared preoccupation. That kind of claim is nearly worthless, because writers working in the same tradition will resemble each other whether or not anybody read anything. What makes this case different is the specificity. It is not a similar theme. It is a sequence of concrete details in the same order, in a passage that has no obvious function in the book, drawn from a source so obscure that the coincidence explanation is doing a great deal of work. Plus the independent confirmation from somebody with no motive to provide it. Elizabeth had every reason to resist the suggestion that her brother's masterpiece contained borrowed material, and she confirmed the reading anyway. So this is about as good as this kind of claim gets, which is worth saying, because I am about to build something on it, and I would rather you knew the foundation had been checked. One more thing about that piece of detective work. He was 30, unknown, and he wrote to the sister of a famous man to ask a question that implied her brother's masterpiece contained borrowed material. She answered him, "That is worth noticing on both sides," he asked, which required a certain amount of nerve. And she answered honestly, at a point when she had every reason not to, some years before she began arranging the legend in earnest. One more thing about the confirmation, because it is easy to miss how unusual it is. Cryptomnesia claims are almost never testable. The writer is dead, the reading history is unknown, and nobody can say what was on a shelf 40 years ago. Here there was a living witness who had been in the room, who remembered the specific book and who had no interest whatever in confirming it. That is the only case of its kind I know of in the literature, which is part of why a short paper by an unknown 30-year-old still gets cited. Chapter 13, the laboratory version, and what you are doing constantly. If you think this is a 19th century curiosity, it is not. It has been done under controlled conditions, and the results are very tidy. In 1989, Alan Brown and Dana Murphy ran a set of experiments on what they called unconscious plagiarism. The design is elegant. You put people in small groups and have them generate items in turn, taking it in rotation to produce, say, examples from a category. Then, later, you ask each person to recall which items they themselves produced, and separately to generate new items that nobody produced. People reliably claim other people's contributions as their own. In the recall task, a measurable proportion of the items each participant reported as theirs had in fact been produced by somebody else in the group minutes earlier. And in the new items task, people generated items that had already been said, believing them to be novel. This has been replicated many times with different materials and different designs. The effect is robust, and it is larger when the original item came from the person sitting next to you, and larger when attention was divided. And these are ordinary people in a laboratory over minutes with no illness of any kind. Nietzsche did it over 30 years. But he was not doing something exotic. He was doing what everybody in that laboratory did, on a longer time scale, in a condition where his critical apparatus was down. Let me push it one step further, because it lands somewhere quite consoling. If you sat down tonight and tried to identify the origin of your own convictions, you would fail at almost every one. The things you believe about how people should behave, your sense of what is embarrassing, your taste, your politics, the specific set of things you find funny, the phrase you use when you are annoyed, which is your father's phrase. Almost none of that arrived with the receipt. It came from somewhere and the tag came off, and what remains is a conviction that feels like it grew in you. That is cryptomnesia at the scale of a whole personality, and it is not a defect. It is how a person is assembled. Now bring it to 1 in the morning. The voice that says the harsh thing about you in the flat certain tone is very often a quotation. It is somebody's actual sentence from a long time ago with the tag off. The reason it feels like the truth rather than like an opinion is not that it is true. It is that the source has been lost, and a sentence with no visible source is experienced as a fact about the world. That is worth knowing, because sometimes, if you sit with it, the tag comes back. And a sentence with a face attached to it is a much smaller object than a sentence that seems to come from the structure of reality. There is one more implication of all this that is worth drawing out, because it is genuinely destabilizing and also, I think, freeing. You do not have privileged access to your own mind. That sounds like a philosophical claim, and it is actually a mundane empirical one. You cannot see the process that produces your thoughts, you see the output. Everything you believe about why you think what you think is a reconstruction made afterwards, using the same equipment you would use to guess at somebody else's reasons. Which means that your account of yourself is a theory built from observation exactly like your account of anybody else. It has the advantage of much more data and the disadvantage of enormous bias. And there is a reasonable argument that those roughly cancel. The practical consequence at 1 in the morning is this. The confident sentence about your own character arriving in your own voice from inside your own head is not testimony from a witness. It is a theory, produced by a system with no direct access to the thing it is theorizing about working at its worst hour. From a curated sample, you would not accept that from a stranger. You are under no obligation to accept it from yourself. One more consequence, and it is the practical one. If your account of your own motives is a theory rather than a report, then it can be improved by evidence, and the evidence is your behavior over time, which is a genuinely useful reframing at 1 in the morning when the mind is producing confident sentences about what you are really like. Those sentences are hypotheses. They can be tested against what you actually did last year, and last year is checkable, and the check is a daylight activity. Chapter 14. Jung's own 6 years compressed. I am going to compress the next part deliberately, because it is a whole story of its own, and it is not tonight's. Between 1913 and 1919, Jung went through a period in which his own mind produced material with overwhelming force. Visions in daylight, figures who spoke to him and taught him things. A sustained encounter with what he took to be the objective contents of his own psyche. He recorded it in a set of black notebooks and then transcribed it over 16 years into a large red leather folio which was not published until 2009. He was frightened by it. He thought at points that he was going mad, and he came out of it with the material that occupied him for the rest of his life. The reason I raise it here is not for its own sake. It is because it makes him the control case. 2 men, roughly a generation apart, both in the German-speaking world, both of an unusual and susceptible temperament, both of whom went into the same territory and had material of overwhelming authority delivered to them from inside. One of them came back and lived another 42 productive years. The other did not. The whole seminar is Jung asking why, and he had an unusually strong motive for asking because he did not think the difference was that he was better. It is worth being clear about what makes him a legitimate comparison case rather than a convenient one. 4 things line up. Both were German-speaking, from religious households, of unusual intellectual gifts, and of a temperament that everybody around them remarked on. Both, at around the same age, entered a period in which material arrived with overwhelming force and presented itself as coming from elsewhere. Both produced out of that period a text in an elevated and unusual style, written at speed, which they regarded afterwards as different in kind from their other work. And both were entirely aware at the time that what was happening to them was dangerous. That is a close enough match that the comparison is worth making. And the outcomes could hardly be further apart. One man produced a private folio and 42 further years of ordinary professional life. The other produced 4 books in 12 months and then stopped speaking. Which makes the question a real question rather than a rhetorical one. Something differed. The rest of tonight is an attempt to say what, and to be honest about how much of it is knowable. It is worth adding one more difference between the 2 cases, and it is the least flattering to Jung. He was older. The confrontation began when he was 38, with 15 years of clinical work behind him, a built career, and an established position to return to. Nietzsche's 10 days at Rapallo came at 38 as well, but he had been out of employment for 4 years by then, and had been ill for a decade, and had no position of any kind. Same age, entirely different amount of ballast. And ballast is not a virtue. It is worth putting one more difference on the table, and it is the largest. Jung was writing for nobody. The Red Book was not for publication, and he knew that from very early. There was no audience, no deadline, no reception to anticipate, and no possibility of being misread, because nobody was going to read it. Nietzsche was writing books for publication, for a public that did not exist yet, but that he believed would. That changes the activity fundamentally. A private document can be as strange as it needs to be, and can be wrong, and can be abandoned. A book has to be defended. Chapter 15. His answer, and it is not flattering to himself. Jung's account of why he survived it is consistent across everything he wrote and said on the subject for 40 years, and it is remarkably unglamorous. He said his family and his profession were the base to which he could always return, that they proved to him that he was a real, ordinary, existing person, that he had duties and appointments and a house and 5 children and patients who needed him to be functional on a Tuesday morning. He said, in effect, that what saved him was that he had to be at work. Now set Nietzsche's circumstances beside that, item by item. No post after 34. No colleagues, no students. No wife and no children. No fixed address for 10 years. No regular company, an income sufficient for rooms and food, and nothing. else. A body that removed a third of some years, and a body of work that no one was reading, so no feedback of any kind was arriving from outside. There was nothing to come back to. I do not think you can explain the difference between the two lives entirely that way, and Jung himself did not claim it was the whole story. But it is a very large part of it, and it is the part that is available to an ordinary person. The thing that keeps a large idea the right size is not a better idea. It is other people, obligations, and a timetable. It is worth adding one detail to that account, because Jung himself did not always tell it the same way. In some places, he emphasizes the family. In others, he emphasizes the professional work. In the seminar itself, he puts more weight on something else again, the fact that he had, throughout, patients whose material he was working with daily. That third one is the least obvious and possibly the most important. A man who spends every morning listening to other people's unconscious productions has a constant involuntary supply of comparisons. He knows what this material looks like in 20 other people. He can see the family resemblance between what arrives in him and what arrives in a shopkeeper from Zurich with a completely different life. Nietzsche had none of that. Whatever arrived in him arrived without any comparison class at all, in a rented room, with nobody else's version to set beside it. And material with no comparison class is almost impossible to keep in proportion, because proportion is a relative measurement. That is not a claim about either man's stability. It is a claim about the information available to them. One further note on his own account of it. He gave this explanation many times over 40 years, and it did not change, which is unusual for him. He revised a great deal of what he thought about most things. The stability of the answer is itself interesting. Either it was simply true, and he knew it, or it had become the thing he needed to believe about his own survival, and he could not afford to examine it. I lean toward the first, because the circumstances are checkable and they check out. But the second possibility is worth holding, because a man's account of why he did not go under is not a neutral piece of testimony. It is worth noticing what he did with the answer. He built the rest of his professional life around it. The insistence on the ordinary, on the job, on the family, on individuation as something that happens inside a life rather than instead of one, runs through everything he wrote afterwards. Whether or not it was the true explanation of his own survival, he treated it as load-bearing and organized a body of work on top of it. Chapter the 16th of May, 1934. And what he thought he was doing. So, Zurich, the Psychological Club, May 1934. The seminar met in the afternoon, roughly fortnightly during term. There were somewhere between 30 and 40 regular participants, mostly analysts and analysands, many of them English-speaking, which is why he conducted it in English. Notes were taken and circulated privately to members in mimeographed form. The format was simple. A passage from Zarathustra was read out. Jung then talked about it, and members asked questions, and he answered them, often at length and often digressing enormously. They began at the beginning. They proceeded at a rate of a few pages per session. Over 10 semesters, they got roughly 2/3 of the way through a book you can read in a fortnight. The last session was in February 1939. The material was published, edited by James Jarrett, in 1988. in 2 volumes running to something over 1,500 pages. There is an obvious question, which is why anybody would spend 5 years on this in a psychological setting rather than a literary one. His answer was that Zarathustra is not primarily a work of philosophy. It is, he said, a document. It is what came up out of one man when the floor gave way, written down largely as it arrived, in a state its author described as reception rather than composition, which means on Jung's reading that it is the same kind of object as a patient's dream series, or as his own red folio, and can be read the same way, not for its arguments, but for what it shows about the process that produced it. That reading is contestable, and philosophers have contested it, and I will come back to that. But if you accept it for a moment, the 5 years stop looking eccentric. He was not doing a close reading of a book. He was conducting a post-mortem in public over 10 semesters on the mind of a man he was afraid of resembling. It is worth saying what a seminar of that kind actually was, because the word suggests something more formal than the reality. The Psychological Club in Zurich was a private organization with premises, a membership, and a great deal of internal politics. The seminars were held for members, analysts, trainees, patients, and former patients, a substantial number of them English-speaking women of independent means, who had come to Zurich specifically to work with him. The format was loose. A passage was read. He talked. People interrupted. He went off on enormous digressions about alchemy or medieval theology or something a patient had said, and then came back or did not. The notes were taken by members, edited, mimeographed, and circulated privately to the group. They were not published in his lifetime and were not intended to be. Which matters for how we read them. This is not a considered text. It is a transcript of a man thinking out loud in his second language in front of people he knew well over 5 years. That makes it less authoritative and considerably more interesting. You can watch him change his mind, contradict himself, and occasionally say things he would never have printed. It is worth saying who was in that room, because it changes how the transcripts read. A significant proportion of the participants were his patients, or had been. That is not a scandal by the standards of the period, and the arrangement was normal in Zurich at the time. But it means the audience for those 5 years of reflection was substantially composed of people who were in analysis with the man doing the reflecting, which is not a neutral audience for a discussion about whether a great mind can be destroyed by its own ideas, and it may account for some of the certainty in his tone. It is worth being honest about how readable the transcripts are. They are not. 1,500 pages of a man digressing in his second language, taken down by amateurs, lightly edited 50 years later. Almost nobody has read the whole thing, and the parts everybody quotes are a handful of passages that circulate on their own. I mention it because I am about to summarize 5 years of material in a few chapters, and you should know that the summary is doing a great deal of work. Chapter 17. Inflation. Now the central concept, and it is the thing to take away. Jung's word for the failure mode is inflation. The picture behind it is this. There are contents in a person that are larger than the person. Patterns that are older than any individual, that carry enormous energy, that arrive with authority. Whether you accept Jung's account of where those come from is not important tonight. What matters is the observable fact that some thoughts arrive with vastly more force than their content warrants, and that this is a real category everybody recognizes. The healthy relationship is that such a content is encountered and the person remains the person. Inflation is what happens when the boundary does not hold. The ordinary human being merges with the large content and takes on its size, and the result is not that the person becomes powerful. The result is that there is no longer anyone in the room to evaluate it. The symptoms Jung listed are the ones you would expect, and they are ordinary. A conviction of being an exception, a sense of mission that is out of proportion to any actual task, contempt for people who do not see it, a collapse of humor about oneself, an increasing inability to hold the idea and any doubt about it at the same time, and its opposite, which Jung insisted was the same mechanism, the person who is convinced they are uniquely worthless. That is not humility. It is the same loss of proportion in the other direction, and it is just as absolute and just as immune to evidence. Both of those are available at 1 in the morning, and both of them feel like clarity. It is worth giving the concept a fair hearing in its non-mystical form, because you do not need any of Jung's metaphysics to use it. Strip out the archetypes, and what is left is this. Some ideas carry more force than their content warrants, and when one of them arrives, there is a risk of the person being reorganized around it rather than adding it to what they already have. You can observe that without believing anything about the collective unconscious. The convert. The person who has just read one book and now explains everything with it. The founder who cannot hear about any subject except their own. The person who has found the framework that finally explains their childhood and is now applying it to everybody at dinner. None of those people is unwell. Most of them come back within a year or two. And what they have in common is not that their idea was bad, but that it temporarily became the only furniture in the room. That is inflation in its ordinary domestic form, and almost everybody has had a bout of it, and it is very hard to see from inside precisely because the idea is doing the seeing. There is a small practical marker for the domestic version that costs nothing to check. Can you still be bored by it? Not doubt it. Be bored. Notice, in the middle of thinking about it, that you have thought this before and would rather think about something else. Boredom is a sign of ordinary proportion. It means the thing is a subject among subjects, and your attention retains the right to wander off. An idea that has taken over is never boring. That is its most reliable signature, and it is a bad one. One more note on the domestic version. It is usually temporary, and it usually resolves without any intervention at all. Most people who go through a bout of this come out within a year or two having quietly stopped mentioning the thing and are faintly embarrassed about it afterwards. Which is worth knowing, both for yourself and for anybody you are currently finding tedious on a single subject. The base rate is recovery. Chapter 18. The specific charge and the move that does not get made. So, what exactly did Jung say happened to Nietzsche? His claim, made repeatedly across the seminar, is that Nietzsche did not maintain the distinction between himself and Zarathustra. Zarathustra, on this reading, is a figure of the kind Jung would call an archetypal content. The old wise man, the teacher, the one who comes down from the mountain. Nietzsche encountered it in a state of extraordinary receptivity, in 3 10-day bursts, and wrote it down. And then, Jung says, instead of relating to it as something encountered, he identified with it. The evidence Jung points to is largely in the late letters and the last books. The rising tone, the chapter titles of Ecce Homo, which are, and this is not a joke, Why I Am So Wise, Why I Am So Clever, Why I Write Such Good Books, and Why I Am a Destiny. The final notes signed The Crucified and Dionysos. Jung's summary of it was blunt. He said, "The man was swallowed." And here is the thing I would most like you to take from tonight, because it is a practical distinction and it is not obvious. Jung's remedy is not to reject the large content. He never argues that Nietzsche should have dismissed the material or been more skeptical or thought smaller. He regarded Zarathustra as an extraordinary document and said so throughout. The remedy is to keep the material and keep yourself as well. To have the encounter and to remain a person of ordinary size who had it. He described his own procedure, and it is almost childishly literal. When a figure appeared in his own material, he gave it a name and a face, and treated it as a separate person. He argued with it. He wrote down what it said, and then, in daylight, wrote down what he thought about what it said. The figure he is most associated with, an old man with white hair and wings, he described as clearly not himself, and he said that this was the important thing about him, because a figure who is not you can be listened to, disagreed with, and shown the door. A voice that is you has no such status. It is simply what is true. Nietzsche invented a prophet, and then, in Jung's reading, stopped being able to see the gap between the prophet and himself. There is an obvious objection to that account, and it is worth putting now rather than saving it. Nietzsche knew he was not an unreflective man being carried along. He wrote repeatedly and explicitly about the dangers of exactly this, about becoming a follower of your own ideas, about the disciple who misunderstands, about the necessity of losing your teachers. The whole of Zarathustra Part 1 ends with the teacher telling his disciples to go away and be rid of him. A man who writes that is not naive about identification. He has thought about it more carefully than most, which leaves two possibilities, and Jung is aware of both. Either the warning did not protect him, which would be an extremely interesting and rather frightening finding, that knowing about a failure mode in detail provides no immunity to it. Or Jung is wrong, and the collapse was organic, and the grandiosity of the last books is either a symptom of a physical illness or a literary posture that has been misread. I lean toward the second. But the first is not absurd, and we have already seen tonight that understanding something perfectly is entirely compatible with being unable to escape it. It is worth adding the strongest version of Jung's reply to that objection, because he does have one. He would say that writing the warning and being unable to use it is exactly what he means. Inflation, on his account, is not a failure of understanding, it is a failure of position. The person can see the whole mechanism perfectly and describe it beautifully and still be inside it, because the thing that has been compromised is not their knowledge, but the place they are standing. which is, as it happens, the same finding we ran into earlier tonight with a Russian novelist who wrote the definitive description of a compulsion he could not stop. Understanding is not a lever. It never has been. That is the least popular finding in this whole area, and it keeps turning up. Chapter 19. Was he right? Now, the fair-minded chapter, because I am not going to hand you Jung's verdict as fact. There are serious objections, and they deserve stating. The first is that Jung is doing psychology on a text, which is a method with a poor record. Zarathustra is a deliberately constructed literary work in a deliberate style. Reading the grandiosity of its prophet as evidence of the author's mental state is roughly like inferring a novelist's morals from a villain. The second objection is about ecce homo, which carries a lot of Jung's weight. It was written in the autumn of 1888 weeks before the collapse, and it is on any reading an extremely strange book. But it is also, in places, obviously and deliberately funny. The man who wrote Why I Am So Wise had spent 20 years as a satirist of exactly that posture. Whether it is inflation or parody, or both at once, is genuinely unresolved among people who have spent their careers on it. The third objection is the strongest, and it is chronological. If Nietzsche's collapse was an organic event, a tumor, or a vascular disease, or an infection, then a psychological account of the last books may be describing the early effects of a physical illness rather than a spiritual one. And in that case, Jung has built a theory of the soul on the symptoms of a body. The fourth is that Jung had an interest. He was, in 1934, an established figure who had been through his own version and come out. A theory in which the difference is a matter of technique, and in which he had the technique, is a theory that flatters the man proposing it. He was aware of this. It does not make it wrong. It does mean we hold it loosely. My own reading, offered as a reading and not as a fact, is that Jung is describing something real and describing it well, and that he has almost certainly attached it to the wrong patient. There is a fifth objection that I think is the strongest of all, and it is rarely made. The comparison is not fair, because the two men were not attempting the same thing. Jung was a clinician with a practice. His engagement with the material was, from the beginning, framed as investigation. He was going down in order to come back and report, and the coming back was built into the enterprise. Nietzsche was not investigating anything, he was writing a book. The material was raw input to a literary work, and a literary work does not require its author to maintain a stable relationship with its narrator. Novelists do not, as a rule, remain carefully differentiated from their protagonists, and we do not consider that a pathology. So when Jung looks at Zarathustra and sees a failure to maintain a boundary, he may be applying a clinical standard to an activity that was never clinical. That does not dispose of the case entirely. Something did happen in January 1889, but it does suggest that the evidence Jung draws from the books is much weaker than he thought, because the books were doing a different job. One more consideration, and it is about Jung rather than Nietzsche. He needed the case to be psychological. If the collapse was organic, then Zarathustra is simply a book. its late grandiosity is a literary matter, and the whole seminar is a category error conducted over 5 years in front of 35 people. That is a considerable amount at stake for the man doing the interpreting, and it is worth naming, because he never names it himself. Chapter 20. Vastness and the need to accommodate. Now, let us leave 1934 and look at what has actually been established about the state we are circling, because it turns out to be one of the better studied experiences in modern psychology. In 2003, Dacher Keltner and Jonathan Haidt published a paper attempting for the first time to define awe as a research object. Their analysis is that awe has two necessary components. The first is vastness, an encounter with something experienced as far larger than the self. That can be physical, like a mountain or a night sky, or it can be conceptual, like a theory, or social, like a crowd, or it can be a person. The second is need for accommodation. The thing does not fit your existing mental structures, so your structures have to change to take it in. That second one is the important half, and it is what makes awe different from mere pleasure. In awe, something in you has to give way. And the researchers were explicit from the start that this can go badly. Accommodation can fail, or it can succeed in a way that leaves the person permanently reorganized around the new thing, or is associated with a diminished sense of self, which, in the ordinary case, is experienced as relief, and in the bad case, is experienced as dissolution. That is a laboratory description of what Nietzsche described in the composition of Zarathustra, and it is a laboratory description of the state. A person can enter alone in a room at 1 a.m. with an idea that keeps expanding. It is worth adding what the awe research says about the aftermath, because it is the part that bears on tonight. Awe reliably produces a temporary reduction in the felt size of the self. In the studies, this is measured in various ways, including simply asking people to draw themselves. And the drawings get smaller. People report feeling less significant, more connected to something larger, and less preoccupied with their own concerns. For most people, most of the time, that is experienced as relief, and it is associated with increases in generosity and patience in the hours afterwards. The relevant question for us is what happens when it does not stop. A temporary reduction in the size of the self is a holiday. A permanent one is a problem, and it looks like either dissolution, in which there is not enough person left to run a life, or its inverse, in which the self has been replaced by the thing it encountered. Both are versions of the same failure, which is that the accommodation went too far. And there is no reliable way to know in advance whose will and whose will not. It is worth adding what the accommodation actually costs, because the word makes it sound administrative. Your existing structures have to give way, and structures are what you use to know where you are. Which is why awe is so frequently reported alongside fear, and why the same experience is described by different people as the best hour of their life and as terrifying. Both are accurate. Something did give way. Whether that lands as relief or as vertigo depends on what was resting on it. It is worth adding that awe is normally social. Almost everywhere it has been studied, the states that go well are shared. The crowd, the congregation, the audience, the family standing at the same viewpoint. Solitary awe is not rare, but it lacks the thing that shared awe supplies automatically, which is a second person having roughly the same experience at the same moment and thereby confirming its scale from outside. Nietzsche's overwhelming 10 days were alone in rented rooms. Jung's material arrived alone at a desk and was then discussed for the next 40 years with a great many people. The difference in what happens next is not mysterious. One more note on the vastness component. It does not have to be large in any physical sense. The research includes people reporting awe at a piece of mathematics, at a chess game, at a single sentence, at somebody's competence. What produces it is a perceived scale that exceeds your existing frame, and a frame can be exceeded by something very small, which is worth knowing because it means the state is not reserved for mountains and cathedrals and can arrive on a Tuesday from something nobody else in the room noticed. Chapter 21. The Family of Experiences. In 2017, David Yaden and colleagues published a review setting out what they called self-transcendent experiences, and their contribution was to place them on a continuum rather than treating each as its own exotic species. At the mild end, absorption in a piece of music, being lost in a landscape, flow in work, ordinary mindfulness. In the middle, the experiences reported in intense prayer or meditation, or in strong awe. At the far end, complete dissolution of the boundary between self and world, reported in mystical experience and in certain drug states, with a characteristic set of features that are remarkably consistent across cultures. Two findings from that literature matter tonight. The first is that these experiences are extremely common. Large surveys have consistently found that a third to a half of ordinary people report having had at least one experience they would place near the strong end of that scale. It is not the property of mystics. The second is that they are among the most durable experiences a person can have. People report them decades later as among the most significant events of their lives, and the reported personality changes are measurable in some studies. Whatever is happening, it leaves a mark that ordinary experience does not, which means the raw material Nietzsche was working with is not rare or pathological. It is a normal human capacity at a high setting. One more thing about that continuum, because it has a consequence people rarely draw. If these experiences sit on a spectrum that everybody is on, then everybody has a personal ceiling, and most people never find out where theirs is. You discover it accidentally, through grief or illness, or a drug you were given in a hospital, or exhaustion, or a piece of music in a particular week, or a landscape at the right moment when you were already unguarded. And because it is accidental, it arrives without preparation and usually without anybody to talk to about it afterwards. Which is why so many people are walking around with one experience they have never mentioned to anybody. Not a delusion, not a symptom. One afternoon or one night, 20 years ago, that does not fit the rest of their account of themselves, and which they have quietly filed away because there was nowhere to put it. If you have one of those, you are in extremely ordinary company. The surveys put the proportion at something between a third and a half. There is one more finding from that literature worth having. These experiences are extremely poorly predicted by anything about the person. Not by belief, not by temperament, not by whether they were looking for one. The best predictor anybody has is roughly the same as the predictor for déjà vu. It happens to a lot of people, and there is no reliable way to say who, which means that if you have never had one, that is not a deficiency, and if you have, it is not a credential. One more thing about that number. If a third to a half of people have had one of these, then in any ordinary room of 10 people, 3 or 4 have had an experience they have never mentioned, which means the silence is not evidence of rarity, it is evidence that there is no available way to raise it, and that everybody has independently concluded they are the odd one. That is a solvable problem, and it is solved by exactly one person saying it out loud first, which is a disproportionately useful thing to be. It is worth adding one more thing about that trait, and this hour specifically. Absorption does not switch off at night. It is at its highest when there is least coming in, which means the people most likely to be lying awake with an idea that has grown too large are the same people who, during the day, are unusually good at being absorbed in work, in music, in other people. Same aperture, different hour. The thing that makes you good company at 4 in the afternoon is the thing that keeps you awake at 4 in the morning, and it is not two problems. Chapter 22. The part that is not advertised. Now the honest half, because the popular presentation of all this is relentlessly positive, and the research is not. The same literature documents that these states have a difficult side, and the work on it is careful. The best characterized evidence comes from controlled studies of intense, self-transcendent states in laboratory conditions, where researchers developed a specific instrument, the challenging experience questionnaire, to measure the difficult end. It was needed because a substantial minority of participants in supervised settings with screening and preparation reported experiences dominated by fear, grief, a sense of insanity, or a sense of dying, and in the survey work outside the laboratory, the proportion is higher and the aftermath sometimes lasts. I am naming that literature to establish one point and one point only, and I want to be clear that nothing here is a recommendation about anything. An experience of self-transcendence is not intrinsically benign, its valence is not under the control of the person having it, and the same state that produces the best hour of somebody's life produces the worst hour of somebody else's. Which is the answer to a question you might reasonably have been forming, which is whether Nietzsche's 10 days of reception were a good thing or a bad thing. They were both, and there was no way to tell in advance, and the difference was not the quality of the man. There is a caveat about that literature that I want to state plainly, because it is easy to overread. Those studies are conducted under conditions that have almost nothing in common with anything happening in your bedroom. Screened participants, prepared in advance, supervised throughout, followed up afterwards, and even then a substantial minority report the difficult version. I am not citing them to say anything about substances, and nothing tonight is a recommendation about anything. I am citing them for one narrow purpose, which is to establish that self-transcendent states have a documented difficult side under the most controlled conditions anybody has managed. Which means the popular framing, in which these experiences are uniformly wonderful and the only risk is not having one, is not supported by the people who have actually measured it. And that matters for reading Nietzsche's 10 Days in Rapallo, because it removes the assumption that an overwhelming creative influx is by nature a good thing that only becomes dangerous through mishandling. Sometimes it is simply difficult, and the difficulty is not the fault of the person having it. One more caveat, and then we move on. Everything in that paragraph is about acute states in controlled settings, and the states we have been discussing tonight are chronic and uncontrolled. I am not claiming they are the same phenomenon. I am claiming they share a feature. The boundary between the person and the content becomes thin, and thinness of that boundary is not intrinsically good or bad. That is a narrow claim, and I do not want it stretched further than it goes. It is worth being clear about why the difficult version is not simply a bad trip in the colloquial sense. What people report is rarely fear of something. It is more often the dissolution itself experienced as annihilation, the sense that the self is ending rather than expanding. Same event, read two ways. And the reading appears to depend heavily on preparation, on setting, and on what the person believes is happening, which is the framing finding again, arriving from a third direction tonight. The state does not carry its own interpretation. Something else supplies that, and what supplies it matters enormously. Chapter 23. Why some people more than others. There is a trait that predicts a great deal of this, and it has been measured since 1974. Auke Tellegen and Gilbert Atkinson developed a scale for what they called absorption, defined as an openness to absorbing and self-altering experiences. The items are ordinary and rather beautiful. Whether you become so caught up in a piece of music that you lose track of where you are, whether textures and colors sometimes seem unusually intense, whether you can vividly recall the smell of something absent, whether you sometimes become so involved in imagining that it is almost like living it. High scorers are not unwell. Absorption correlates with hypnotizability, with openness to experience, and with creative work. It is a fairly stable trait. And it also predicts the frequency of unusual perceptual experiences and susceptibility to being carried by an idea, which reframes the whole question rather usefully. There is a kind of person for whom experience arrives at higher volume. That person is disproportionately likely to be the one who writes the book, paints the picture, or has the vision. And the same trait leaves them more exposed to being taken over by whatever arrives. If that description is you, and a proportion of the people listening to a channel like this will recognize themselves in it, then it is worth knowing that this is a known dimension of ordinary human variation. It is not a fault. It carries a specific risk. And the risk is not the size of what arrives. It is the absence of anybody standing next to it. It is worth saying something reassuring about that trait, because people who recognize themselves in it often take it badly. High absorption is not a vulnerability with no upside. It is the same capacity that produces the best experiences most people ever have. The piece of music that took the top of your head off. The book you disappeared into for a weekend. The state in which work stops feeling like work. Being genuinely moved by a landscape. The capacity to be completely present with another person. All of that is the same trait, and people who score low on it do not have a safer version of those experiences. they largely do not have those experiences. So the honest framing is not that this is a risk factor, it is that it is a wide aperture which lets in more of everything, and the management problem is a consequence of the same feature that makes the good parts good. Nobody would trade it once they understand what the trade is. But it does mean the management problem is yours to solve rather than optional, and that nobody without the trait will understand why you need to. It is worth noting that the trait is largely stable and largely not chosen. You cannot decide to be less absorbable any more than you can decide to be less tall. Attempts to do it by force tend to produce numbness rather than proportion. What is adjustable is not the aperture, but what stands next to you while it is open, which is again the whole of tonight, in one sentence, arriving from a completely different direction. It is worth adding one protective factor that does appear to be adjustable: sleep. Almost everything we have discussed tonight gets worse without it, and the relationship runs both ways. The states that thin the boundary are more likely when sleep is short, and they in turn make sleep harder. That is not a trivial observation for a recording made to help people sleep. If you take one physical thing from tonight rather than one psychological thing, it is that the boundary you are trying to maintain is substantially a function of how much you have slept this week. Chapter 24, Turin and 4 explanations with no verdict. The end of Nietzsche's lucid life, told as carefully as I can and no further. He had spent 1,888 in Turin in a rented room, and it had been the most productive year of his life, several books in 12 months. The letters from December are already strange. They are exuberant, then grandiose, then unmistakably disordered. He wrote to friends and to strangers, and to at least one head of state, in a register that alarmed the people who received them. Some of the last notes are signed Dionysos, some are signed the Crucified. On or around the 3rd of January, he collapsed in the street. The story attached to it is famous, that he saw a cabman beating a horse, ran to it, threw his arms around the animal's neck, and went down. That story appears in later accounts, and its provenance is genuinely poor. There is no contemporaneous eyewitness statement. Serious biographers flag it as unverified and possibly a later accretion. I mention it because you will have heard it, and because it should be labelled. His friend Franz Overbeck was contacted, came from Basel, found him in a state Overbeck described in letters that are painful to read, and took him back by train. He was admitted to a clinic in Basel, then in Jena. He never wrote again. What caused it is not settled, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. The traditional account, which held for most of the 20th century, was tertiary syphilis, on the basis of the clinical diagnosis made at the time and the general symptom picture. That account has been substantially challenged. The objections are specific. The survival for 11 years does not match the usual course. The absence of certain expected signs, and the fact that the original diagnosis rested on a reported history that may not be reliable. A second hypothesis proposes a slow-growing tumour behind the right eye, which would account for the decades of headaches and progressive visual loss, as well as the terminal deterioration. A third proposes an inherited small vessel disease of the brain, which fits the family history, including his father's early death from a neurological illness and the long prodrome. A fourth position, held by some, is that there was an organic process and also a psychological collapse, and that separating them is a category error. I list them, and I decline to choose, and I want to say why in a way that is useful to you rather than merely scrupulous. We are being asked to diagnose a man from documents, without an examination, without imaging, without a reliable history, on evidence assembled by people who wanted him to be one thing or another. You do the same operation on yourself at 1 in the morning, from documents without an examination, on evidence assembled by a part of your mind that has a position. If the standard is not good enough for a man who has been dead 125 years, it is not good enough for you at 2. It is worth adding one more piece of context about that period, because the popular image is of a sudden collapse, and the record does not show one. The letters of December 1888 deteriorate gradually. They begin merely exuberant, which is not out of character for him. They become expansive. Then the claims widen about the significance of the books, about what is about to happen in Europe, about his own importance. Then the recipients change. People he barely knew, people he had quarreled with years earlier, at least one head of state. By the last week, the signatures have changed and the content is unmistakable. That is a slope, not a cliff, and it runs over perhaps 3 weeks, which matters for one practical reason. Everybody around him was at a distance, receiving these letters days apart in the post, with no way to compare notes. Overbeck, in Basel, saw a handful of them and acted immediately, and he was the only person positioned to notice the trend at all. Distance is what made it invisible. If any 2 of those correspondents had been in the same room, it would have been obvious a fortnight earlier. It is worth adding what did not happen in those weeks. Nobody stopped him. He was in a foreign city, in rented rooms, eating in restaurants, walking in public, writing and posting letters, for at least 3 weeks in an obviously deteriorating state. He was not friendless, and he was not unknown. He was simply not in the same room as anybody who knew him, and letters take days, and by the time the pattern was visible from a distance, it had already gone a long way. One last note about that December. He was working extremely well. That is the part that unsettles people. The letters were becoming disordered while the books were being finished, and some of what he produced in those final months is among the best writing he ever did. Deterioration and productivity are not opposites and did not take turns. They ran at the same time, in the same weeks, in the same man, which is one reason nobody around him acted sooner. Chapter 25. 11 years and a sister. He lived until 1900, cared for by his mother until her death in 1897, and then by his sister. And what Elizabeth did in those years is a matter of record. She had returned from Paraguay, where she and her husband had founded a colony on explicitly anti-Semitic principles, a project her brother had been scathing about. His letters on the subject of her husband and his opinions are among the least ambiguous things he ever wrote. She took control of the papers, established an archive, and set about building a reputation. She arranged the house so that visitors could be shown her brother. She published, and she assembled, from his notebooks, a book called The Will to Power, presenting it as his unfinished masterwork. It was not. It was a selection made by her and an editor from thousands of notes, ordered according to a plan she chose, including material he had discarded, and it created for decades an impression of his thought that scholarship has since had to dismantle. The critical editions have restored the notebooks to their actual state, and the constructed book is no longer treated as a work. The effect of that on his reputation and on the uses his name was put to in the following half-century was very large. I include this for one reason. The last chapter of Nietzsche's life was written by somebody else after he could no longer speak, and it determined what 100 years of people thought he had said. There is a specific harm in what she did that is worth naming, because it is not only a matter of literary reputation. She made him unfalsifiable. By assembling notes into a book he never wrote and presenting it as his culminating work, she created a text that could be quarried for almost any position. The notes span years, contradict each other, include material he had explicitly discarded, and were never organized by him into an argument. So for half a century, anybody wanting to claim him could find a passage, and anybody wanting to dismiss him could find a different one, and neither could be settled by appeal to the text, because the text was a construction. The critical editions fixed this, and the scholarship since is a great deal more careful. But the episode is a very clean illustration of something worth carrying. The most effective way to distort somebody is not to lie about them. It is to publish a selection of their own words arranged by you under a title they never chose. It is worth being fair to her in one respect. She nursed him for 3 years in conditions that were not easy, at a point when there was no money and no prospect of any. The archive, the falsification, and the rest came after, and they are indefensible. But somebody had to do the daily work of caring for a man who could not speak or dress himself, and she did it, and it lasted years. That does not balance the ledger. It belongs in it. It is worth stating what the falsification cost him specifically. For most of the 20th century, he was read as the philosopher of a politics he despised, on the strength of a book he did not write, assembled by a woman whose husband's opinions he had denounced in writing. That is close to the worst thing that can happen to a body of work, and it took the better part of a century and a great deal of scholarly labour to undo. It is also the strongest possible argument for keeping your own papers in order, which is a mundane conclusion to draw from a tragedy, and I think the correct one. Chapter 26. The one who had somebody to be at work for. Come back to the comparison, and let us be careful about it, because the neat version is too neat. Jung had a wife who was herself a serious practitioner. 5 children, a house, a practice, colleagues, an institution with minutes, and a professional identity that required him to be functional on a Tuesday morning. He said, plainly and repeatedly, that this is what kept him. Nietzsche had none of it. But I do not want to leave you with the impression that Nietzsche made a lifestyle error, because the causation runs both ways, and mostly the other way. He did not choose solitude over a family. He was ill, in an age with no treatment, in a way that made ordinary employment impossible and ordinary company difficult, and the isolation was very largely the consequence. So the honest statement is not that he should have had more friends. It is that the protective factor was not available to him, and that it was available to Jung and that the difference in outcome is at least partly a difference in circumstance rather than in character or technique, which is worth knowing for a reason that is not about either of them. If you are managing something difficult and you have a job, a household, people who expect you, a standing arrangement on a Thursday, then you are already carrying a large part of the protection, and you are probably not counting it as anything at all because it is invisible and dull. And if you are managing something difficult and you do not have those, then the shortfall is structural and not a defect in you, and building even one of them back is worth more than any amount of insight. It is worth resisting one reading of this because it is the sentimental one and it is not quite right. The claim is not that Nietzsche needed friends and Jung had them. Nietzsche had friends, Overbeck for 20 years, others who wrote and visited and worried. He was not friendless, and treating this as a story about loneliness in the ordinary sense flattens it. The difference is not affection. It is structural contact. Jung had people who required things of him at fixed times, patients at 9, a household at 6, a committee with minutes, 5 children with school terms. Those are not friendships. Several of them were probably irritating, and they constitute a scaffold that holds a person in place regardless of their internal state. Nietzsche had affection at a distance, conducted by letter, with nobody who needed him to be anywhere on a Tuesday. That distinction matters practically because affection is hard to arrange and obligation is not. If you are worried about somebody, the useful intervention is very often not more warmth. It is a standing arrangement, a regular thing, at a set time that they are expected at. There is a small practical version of this that anybody can arrange in a week. One standing thing, at a fixed time, involving at least one other person, that happens whether or not you feel like it. It does not have to be meaningful. A class, a walk with somebody, a shift somewhere, a weekly call. Its function is not enjoyment and not support. Its function is to be a fixed point that does not care what is happening inside you, and which therefore keeps happening while the inside is in flux. It is worth adding the least romantic feature of that scaffold. Most of it is other people's needs, not your own. Patients who require you at 9, children who require breakfast, a committee that requires minutes. None of that is designed for your benefit, and much of it is annoying. And it is the load-bearing structure, which is a slightly deflating thing to be told and worth knowing anyway. A substantial part of what keeps people upright is being needed at fixed times by people who are not thinking about your welfare at all. Chapter 27. What friction does. Let me be concrete about why other people work, because the mechanism is not sentimental. An idea in a single head has no resistance. It grows to whatever size the head permits. It is never asked to explain itself in ordinary words to somebody who has not been following. It is never met with a bored expression. It never has to survive being said out loud in a kitchen. Say it out loud in a kitchen, and one of two things happens. Either it survives, and it comes back to you slightly smaller and considerably more solid, because it has been through language and through another mind, and it still stands. Or it does not survive, and you discover, in the 2 seconds after saying it, that it was made of the conditions in which you had it, and it does not travel. That second event is not a loss. It is the cheapest possible way of finding out, and it takes about 4 seconds. And the alternative is finding out in 3 years. The whole practice Jung built for himself is a technology for producing that friction in the absence of another person. Write it, draw it, give it a name, argue with it. Come back tomorrow and read what you wrote. It is a way of manufacturing a second person when you do not have one in the room. There is a smaller version of this that is worth having, because most people cannot manufacture a household on demand. Say it out loud once, to one person, in ordinary language. Not the full account, not a confession, just the thing, said in words, to somebody who has not been following, in the way you would explain it to a stranger on a train. The reason this works has nothing to do with their response. It works because the act of putting it into ordinary language for somebody who lacks all your context forces the thing through a compression it has never had to survive. Inside your head, it can remain a felt shape. Out loud, it has to become sentences, in order with the connections stated. A great many large nighttime convictions do not survive that operation, and they do not survive it in the first 30 seconds. And the ones that do survive come back to you noticeably more solid, because they have now been through a process, and you know something about them you did not know before. And one more thing about friction, because it is easy to hear as a recommendation to seek criticism. It is not. Criticism, especially unsolicited, tends to produce defense, and defense hardens the position. What works is not somebody attacking the idea, it is somebody simply not being interested in it. An ordinary conversation about ordinary things with a person who has their own concerns does more to restore proportion than an argument ever will. It is worth naming the specific fear that stops people doing this, that saying it out loud will make it sound stupid, which is exactly right and is the point. Some of it will sound stupid, and that is information you cannot get any other way, and it costs about 4 seconds to obtain. The alternative is carrying it for another 2 years in the only environment where it never has to survive being said, which is inside your own head at 1 a.m. Chapter 28. The small move that measures. And here is the modern version, which is smaller and better evidence than anything Jung had. Ethan Kross and Özlem Ayduk have spent 2 decades on self-distancing. The core experiment: take people, have them recall a genuinely distressing experience, and vary one thing only. One group replays it from inside their own eyes, in the first person. The other group is asked to step back and watch it from a distance, as an observer. The distance group shows lower emotional reactivity, lower physiological arousal, and, on follow-up days later, less recurrence. The mechanism identified is that the distance group spontaneously starts explaining, and the immersed group starts re-feeling. And there is a linguistic version that sounds absurd until you look at the data. Using your own name, or the second person, in self-talk during a difficult moment produces measurable reductions in distress and better performance under social stress compared with saying I. Not what am I going to do, what are you going to do? It is one word and it measures. There is a related finding sometimes called Solomon's paradox. People reason more wisely about other people's problems than their own, and the gap closes substantially when they are asked to think about their own situation in the third person. I will not oversell any of it. The effects are modest, and this is a young field. But notice what it is. It is a laboratory-grade 5-second version of what a man in Zurich did by inventing an old man with kingfisher wings and arguing with him. There is a nuance in the self-distancing work that is worth having because it stops it becoming avoidance. Distance is not detachment. The instruction is not to stop feeling the thing, or to be cool about it, or to pretend it does not matter. Participants in those studies are not asked to disengage. They are asked to change vantage point while continuing to attend fully. That distinction is doing real work. Avoidance is associated with poorer outcomes almost everywhere it has been measured. Distancing is not avoidance. The person is still looking directly at the difficult thing from a slightly different position. The analogy I find useful is that of standing back from a painting. You have not stopped looking at it. You have stopped standing so close that you can only see brushwork, which is exactly what he was doing with Philemon. He was not avoiding the material. He was giving it a face so that he could look at it from across a room instead of from inside it. It is worth being honest about effect sizes here. The distancing findings are real and replicated, and they are modest. Nobody in those studies is transformed. What is measured is a shift, reliable in direction and small in magnitude. I mention it because this material gets sold as a technique that will change your life. And it will not. And overselling it means that when it produces a small effect, people conclude it does not work. It works. It works a little. A little, applied at 3 a.m, is not nothing. One more practical form for people who will not talk to anybody. Write it as though explaining it to somebody who does not know you. Not a diary entry. A letter to a stranger, with the background filled in, the connections stated, and the assumptions made explicit. It produces most of the compression that talking produces because the constraint is the same, an audience without your context. And you can do it at 11 a.m. with nobody involved. Chapter 29, Grievance. Before we close, I want to name the most common form this takes, because it is not a philosophical idea and almost nobody thinks of it in these terms. The commonest large content that swallows an ordinary person is a grievance. Something was genuinely done to you. That is not in question, and I am not going to ask you to be reasonable about it. But watch the shape it takes over years, because it is exactly the shape we have been describing. It starts as something you have, it explains one event, then it explains more. Then it begins to arrive uninvited during unrelated things. Then it becomes load-bearing. You can no longer be asked to consider that it might be partly otherwise, because the question is no longer about the event, it is about you. And it does the same thing to a life that Zarathustra did to Nietzsche's. It gets larger, it takes on authority, and eventually there is nobody standing beside it. The cruelty of it is that being right is no protection at all. A true grievance inflates exactly as readily as a false one, possibly more, because it never runs into a refutation. I am not going to tell you to let it go. That is not advice, it is an instruction with no mechanism attached, and people who give it have generally not had anything much done to them. I'm going to say the smaller thing that follows from tonight. Give it a name and put it in a chair. Not because it is wrong, because there needs to be somebody in the room who is not it. It is worth being careful about one thing here, because I do not want this to become an argument for letting things go that should not be let go. Some grievances should be held. There are injuries that were real, that were nobody's fault but the person who caused them, and that it would be a moral error to release. The instruction to move on is very often issued by people who benefit from your moving on, and a certain amount of what passes for wisdom on this subject is simply pressure applied on behalf of whoever did it. So I am not going to ask you to put it down. The distinction is narrower, and it is about custody rather than content. You can hold a grievance permanently, accurately, with full force, and remain a separate person from it. Or the grievance can hold you, in which case it will start deciding things: who you talk to, what you notice, how you read a text message from somebody unrelated. The first is memory, and it costs you nothing you were not already owed. The second is the arrangement we have been describing all night, and the fact that it grew from something true does not make it any less expensive. One further note on grievances specifically. They are the only kind of large idea that gets stronger when it is confirmed and stronger when it is denied. If the other person admits it, that is proof. If they deny it, that is proof of the denial. If they apologize insufficiently, that is proof of the insufficiency, which makes it structurally unfalsifiable in the same way we discussed earlier. And it is worth knowing that the thing you are holding may have that shape regardless of how true its origin was. It is worth saying one more thing to anybody holding a real one. Holding it is not the same as being at war about it. You can keep the full account, refuse every invitation to soften it, decline to forgive, and still not have it running your Tuesday. The two get bundled together by everybody who wants you to move on, and they are separable, and the separation is the entire freedom available in the situation. Chapter 30. The same thing, pointing down. I said earlier that inflation has a mirror image, and I want to give it a chapter of its own, because for most people listening, it is the far more relevant one. Jung was insistent about this, and it is the least intuitive part of the concept. The man who is convinced he is a world historical figure, and the man who is convinced he is uniquely worthless, are, on his account, in the same condition. Both have lost ordinary size. Both are dealing in absolutes. Both have a content that has expanded until there is nobody left standing beside it. And both are equally immune to evidence, which is the diagnostic feature. Test it against the one in the morning version. The sentence is not, "I handled that badly." The sentence is, "I have wasted my life." It is not, "I have been difficult to live with lately." It is, "I have ruined everything for everybody." It is not a proportionate account with a next action attached. It is a total verdict delivered with enormous authority about your entire nature. That is grandiosity. It is simply grandiosity with the sign reversed. And it behaves identically. Offer a counterexample, and it is absorbed. Point out a thing that went well, and the voice explains why that does not count. It cannot be argued with because it is not an argument, which means the response to it is not a better case for the defense. You cannot win that trial. The court is not neutral, and the verdict was written before the evidence. The response is the same as for the other kind. Not refutation, separation. Somebody has to be in the room who is not the verdict. There is a reason the downward version is harder to spot, and it is worth naming. Grandiosity is socially punished, and self-abasement is socially rewarded. If you announce that you are the most important person in the room, somebody will correct you within the hour. The world is full of correction for that error, and it arrives fast. If you announce that you are worthless, almost nobody corrects it. Some people will reassure you briefly and then move on. Some will privately think you are being appropriately humble. And a certain number will simply accept the valuation and treat you accordingly. So the upward version gets sanded down by ordinary life, and the downward version does not. It can run for decades uncorrected, being mistaken for modesty by everybody, including the person holding it. Which is why it is worth applying the same test to it that you would apply to the other. Not, is it true, but can I hold it and also hold that I might be wrong about it? If the answer is no, it is not humility. It is the same failure pointing down. It is worth stating the practical consequence of that symmetry. The response to both is the same, and it is not reassurance. Telling somebody in the downward version that they are actually rather good is exactly as useless as telling somebody in the upward version that they are not that special. Both are corrections aimed at the content, and the content is not the problem. What helps in both cases is the same small thing, another person in the room being ordinary over time. One further note on the downward version, because it has a particular relationship to this hour. It is almost exclusively nocturnal. The upward version can run in daylight quite happily, and often does. The downward version generally cannot survive contact with an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, which is why it waits. That timing is itself diagnostic. A verdict that only ever appears between 1 and 4 and never at 11 in the morning is telling you something about its evidentiary basis. Chapter 31. What Jung Kept. It would be easy to come away from this thinking Jung's view of Nietzsche was a diagnosis and nothing more, and that would be a serious misreading. He read him for 60 years. He kept coming back. He gave 5 years of his working life to one of the books, and he took things from him that are still visible in the middle of his own system. The idea that the moral inheritance a person receives has a history and can be examined, rather than being simply the way things are. The idea that there is a great deal in a person that the conscious mind does not want and pushes down, and that it does not go away. The insistence that the task of a life is to become the particular person you actually are, rather than a good copy of a general one. Jung's whole account of individuation is unthinkable without that last one, and he acknowledged the debt. So what the seminar actually is, when you read it, is not a post-mortem conducted by an opponent. It is closer to something a man does about a figure he loved and was frightened by, which is a much more common relationship than we usually admit and much harder to hold. You can be enormously indebted to something that also nearly took you. Most people over 50 have at least one of those. A person, a job, a belief, a place. Handling it well does not mean deciding whether it was good or bad. It means being able to hold both without needing the question settled. It is worth being specific about the debt because vague acknowledgement is cheap. 3 things at least. The idea that morality has a history, that it was made by people with interests at particular times and can therefore be examined rather than obeyed. Jung's entire willingness to treat religious material as psychological data rather than as truth or nonsense runs through that door. The idea that what a person rejects does not disappear, and that the more strenuously it is refused, the more forcefully it operates. Jung's shadow is a direct descendant, and he said so. And the insistence that the task is to become the particular person you are, rather than a competent copy of a general one. Individuation is that idea with a clinical apparatus attached. Take those 3 out of Jung, and there is not much of a system left, which makes the seminar a stranger document than it first appears. 5 years of a man conducting a careful post-mortem on somebody he had robbed. There is one more thing he took, and it is the least acknowledged: the permission to write about the psyche in a non-scientific register. Almost nobody in Jung's professional environment was writing that way. The pressure was entirely toward the laboratory, and the model available to him for a serious body of work about the interior life, written in an elevated and personal style, was the man he spent 5 years diagnosing. The Red Book is unimaginable without Zarathustra. It is written in a deliberately archaic, prophetic voice by a man who had read one and had been frightened by it, and did it anyway. It is worth noticing that Jung never really said any of this. He acknowledged influence in general terms and gave Nietzsche credit in passing, but he never wrote the essay that would have set out the debt properly, and in the seminar he is overwhelmingly the diagnostician rather than the inheritor. That is a very human failure, and it is not unusual. It is extremely difficult to be publicly generous about somebody whose fate frightens you, because the generosity feels like an admission that you are the same kind of thing. Chapter 32. The Friend Who Went to Fetch Him. There is one more person in this story who deserves his chapter, and he did not write anything anybody reads. Franz Overbeck was a professor of theology at Basel. He and Nietzsche had shared a house there in the 1870s. They were, as far as the record shows, opposites in temperament. Overbeck careful, conventional, quiet, professionally cautious, a man who kept his post for decades. They stayed friends for the whole of Nietzsche's working life, and it was not an easy friendship to maintain. Nietzsche's books became stranger. His views became less socially convenient. He was often unwell and often difficult, and moved constantly. In early January 1889, the letters Overbeck received made it clear that something had happened. He got on a train, alone, travelled from Basel to Turin, found his friend in the room, in the state he was in, and brought him back across the Alps by rail. It took days. He described it afterwards in letters, and the description is not literary. It is a man writing down the worst thing he has ever done. He then spent much of the rest of his life protecting the record from Elizabeth's version. That is not a philosophical contribution, and it has no theory attached. But if you are looking for the practical difference between the two men at the centre of tonight, part of it is that Nietzsche had exactly one Overbeck and needed him at 44, and Jung had a whole household. And it is worth saying plainly at 1 a.m, that being an Overbeck is available to anybody, requires no ability whatsoever, and is the single most useful thing one person can be to another. He did not understand the books. He got on a train. It is worth saying what that journey actually involved, because the word rescue makes it sound cleaner than it was. Overbeck had to leave his post at short notice, travel several days across the Alps in early January, find an address in a city he did not know, deal with the landlord, deal with the man himself in the state he was in, and then get him back across the same distance by rail. He had no authority, no medical training, and no plan. And the letters he wrote afterwards make clear that it was the worst experience of his life and that he never really recovered from it. I put that in because the useful figures in these stories are usually described in a sentence, and the sentence hides the cost. Being the person who goes is not a matter of good character in the abstract. It is a matter of somebody deciding on a specific Tuesday to take on days of difficulty and expense with no idea what they will find. Almost everybody has somebody who would do that for them, and almost nobody knows who it is, because the situation has not arisen. One more note on Overbeck, and then we go down. He did not understand the books. He said so. He was a theologian with quite different interests, and the philosophy was not really his subject, and he made no great claims about it. He went anyway. Whatever you are able to offer somebody in difficulty, comprehension is not the requirement. He is remembered because he got on a train. It is worth adding what happened to Overbeck afterwards. He was one of the very few people who resisted the sisters' version publicly at cost to himself for the rest of his life. He knew what he had seen in Turin, and he knew what was being built in Weimar, and he said so, and was largely ignored. Being right early and being ignored is its own kind of ending, and he had it. Chapter 33, 4 seconds. Before we come to the end, here is the whole of tonight in a form small enough to use. There is a test you can run on any thought, and it takes about 4 seconds, and you can do it lying down in the dark. Say the sentence in your head, whatever it is. Then add, out loud or nearly, 5 words. I might be wrong about this. And then notice, without judging it, what happened in your chest. If nothing happened, you are holding a thought, and it is fine, and it can wait until morning. If something rose, if there was a small refusal, if adding those words felt like a betrayal of something, then you are not holding it. It is holding you. And that is not a reason to panic, and it is certainly not a reason to conclude that the thought is false. It is only information about the arrangement. The arrangement is what tonight has been about, not the content. Nobody can tell you at 1 a.m. whether your large thought is true, and I am not going to pretend to. But whether there are 2 things in the room or 1 is a question you can answer immediately, in the dark, without any evidence. And it is the question that determines whether the next 2 hours are survivable. There is a variant of the test that works better for some people, and it is worth having as an alternative. Try to say the thing in somebody else's voice. Take the conviction and imagine it being said to you by a person you respect but do not agree with about everything, or by somebody you find slightly irritating, or read it in the register of an advertisement. If it survives all 3 and still sounds like something, it is probably load-bearing. If it only works in your own voice, at this hour, in the dark, with the particular emphasis you have been giving it, then a good deal of what you have been responding to is delivery rather than content. That is not proof that it is false. Plenty of true things sound thin when said flatly, but it separates the two components which have been fused and which feel at this hour like a single object called the truth. One more version of the test for people who find the verbal ones do not land. Notice whether you can be interrupted. Somebody comes into the room while you are thinking about it, about something completely unrelated and mildly tedious. Can you put it down, be present for 4 minutes, and pick it back up? If yes, you are holding it. If the interruption feels like an assault, and you spend the 4 minutes waiting for them to leave, that is the arrangement telling you what it is. One last version, for the middle of the night specifically. Ask what time it is. Not metaphorically. Actually notice the hour, and notice that the thought is arriving at the hour it always arrives at, and has arrived at before, and will arrive at again. A conviction that keeps a schedule is a conviction with a mechanism, and noticing the mechanism is a small distance, and small distances are what tonight has been about. One more, and it is the simplest. Notice whether you are enjoying it. There is a particular pleasure in a large grievance or a large certainty at 3 in the morning, and it is worth being honest about because it is the thing that keeps you in the chair. If the answer is yes, that is not shameful. It is only useful information about why the session has lasted 2 hours. Chapter 34. What the seminar never got to, and when it is more than an idea. There is something in how the seminar ended that I keep returning to. He never finished. 10 semesters, 5 years, 1,500 pages. And he stopped roughly 2/3 through the book. In February 1939, and the reason was that Europe was about to do again what it had done in 1914. He never went back to it. He lived another 22 years. And I do not think that is a failure, and I do not think it is only history intruding. You can read the transcripts as a man conducting an examination of a fear over 5 years, in public, at a pace of a few pages at a time. And the thing about an examination like that is that it does not need to reach the last page to have done its work. He had asked his question, he had answered it as well as he was going to. The rest of the book was the rest of the book. There is a kind of long-running private inquiry that most people are conducting into one thing, and it very rarely concludes. It stops at some point, because it has stopped being urgent, and the person is often faintly embarrassed about never having finished. Not finishing is not the same as failing. Sometimes the question simply stops being the question, which is the best available outcome, and never feels like one. The necessary chapter. We have been talking about ideas that get too large, and about a state in which the boundary between a person and their material gets thin, and I have deliberately kept it on the ordinary end of that spectrum, because that is where nearly everybody is. There is a further end, and it needs saying out loud. If the thoughts have stopped feeling like thoughts, if there is a conviction you cannot get any distance from at all, and it concerns other people's intentions toward you, or your own significance, or a message being directed at you specifically. If you have not slept properly for several nights, and the ideas are speeding up, if people who know you well have said something. If there is any thought of harming yourself or anybody else, those are not the subject of tonight, and they do not respond to distancing exercises. They respond to a doctor, quickly, and to being taken seriously by somebody qualified, and the outcomes, when that happens early, are very much better than when it happens late. Getting help early is the thing Nietzsche did not have available in 1888 in a rented room in Turin with no one within 400 miles who had seen him in a month. You are not in 1888. It is worth adding something about how a long private inquiry usually ends, because almost nobody is warned. It does not end with an answer. It ends with the question losing its charge. At some point, months or years in, you notice that you have not thought about it for a fortnight. And when you do think about it, the thing that used to produce a physical response produces something closer to mild interest. The question has not been resolved. You could not, if pressed, say what the answer turned out to be. It simply stopped being urgent, and the urgency was doing most of the work. That is faintly disappointing, because the shape of an inquiry promises a conclusion, and there is no conclusion. It is also the ordinary and generally the best outcome, and it is worth knowing about in advance so that you do not mistake the fading for a failure to have understood something. One last note on inquiries that do not conclude. The material does not go to waste. Jung never finished the seminar and never wrote the definitive statement about Nietzsche. And the 5 years turn up everywhere else in his work regardless. In the writing on inflation, on the mana personality, on the second half of life. An unfinished inquiry leaks into everything else you do, which is a better outcome than a conclusion and does not feel like one at the time. Chapter 35. Keeping the idea and yourself and the two rooms. So where does this leave the thought you came in with? Not with instructions to think smaller. That is the wrong lesson, and it is not what the seminar concluded. Nietzsche's mistake on Jung's reading was not that his idea was too large. It may well have been as large as he thought. The mistake was that he stopped being a separate item from it. So the instruction, if there is one, is this: keep the idea, keep yourself as well, which in practice means very ordinary things. Say it out loud to one person who is not obliged to agree. Write it down and read it a week later. Notice whether you can still say the words "I might be wrong about this" without something rising in your chest, and treat that sentence as an instrument rather than a virtue because it measures something. Notice whether you can still laugh about it. That is the most sensitive test there is. An idea you have holds up fine under a joke. An idea you have become cannot survive one, and the moment humour becomes impossible is the moment the boundary has gone. I want to leave you with two rooms. In one of them, in the autumn of 1888, a man of 44 sits alone in rented lodgings in Turin, in the most productive year of his life, writing at extraordinary speed, with no colleagues, no family, no post, almost no correspondence coming back, and a body that has been failing for 15 years. Whatever is arriving in him is arriving at full volume into a completely empty room. In the other, in the spring of 1934, a man of 58 sits in a room in Zurich with 35 people reading a book out loud, a few pages at a time, being interrupted with questions, some of them stupid, and answering them. The difference between those two rooms is not intelligence, and it is not virtue, and I do not think it is even technique. It is that one of them has other people in it. One more distinction before we go down, because it is the one people get wrong when they try to apply this. Keeping yourself does not mean keeping busy. You can be extremely busy and completely swallowed. The grievance is perfectly compatible with a full calendar. The obsession will happily coexist with a job. Activity is not the protection. What protects is contact with things that do not care about the idea. A person who has their own concerns and will change the subject. A task that has to be done correctly regardless of how you feel. An animal that needs feeding at the same hour. A body of work in a completely different area. Anything that constitutes a second, independent measure of what is important. The idea will not survive being the only thing in your life. That is not a moral claim. It is a structural one. Nothing survives being the only thing in a life, including good things, including love, including work. One more thing worth keeping. Ordinary size is not smallness. The instruction is not to think less of yourself, or to shrink the ambition, or to stop taking the thing seriously. He did not do any of that. He took the material more seriously than anybody around him and worked on it for the rest of his life. Ordinary size only means the same size as a person, large enough to carry the thing, not so large that there is nothing left over to carry it with. One more caution about the second thing. It has to be something you would do anyway. A hobby taken up specifically as a counterweight to an obsession becomes part of the obsession within a month, because you are doing it for the obsession's sake. It works only if it has its own reasons. A person you actually like, work that actually interests you, a body that actually needs moving. The indifference to the idea is the whole mechanism, and indifference cannot be manufactured to order. Chapter 36. Ordinary size. So where does that leave the thing you came in with? Not smaller. I have not tried to talk you out of it, and I have no way of knowing whether it is true. Only this, that whether it is true and whether you are separate from it are two entirely different questions. And only the second one is answerable at this hour, and it is the one that decides how the next 3 hours go. Nietzsche's mistake, if it was one, was not that his idea was too big. It may well have been exactly as big as he thought. The mistake, on the reading we have spent tonight examining, is that at some point there stopped being anybody standing next to it. And there is one small mercy in the comparison that is worth having. The difference between the two men was not virtue, and it was not intelligence. One of them had a household, a practice, a wife who understood the theory, a colleague who could follow him down, 5 children, a committee, and a boat on a lake. The other had a rented room above a newsstand, a small pension, an unreliable body, and a stack of unsold books. The protective factor was not something either of them earned. It was circumstance, and one of them had it, and one of them did not. And if that seems unjust, it is because it is. Which means that if you have any of it, a job, a household, a standing arrangement on a Thursday, somebody who expects you, you are already carrying more protection than you are counting, because it is invisible and dull and does not feel like anything. And if you have none of it, the shortfall is structural rather than a fault in you, and rebuilding even one of those is worth more than any amount of thinking. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw soften. Let the weight of you go into whatever is holding it. The large thought will come back, probably in the hour after this stops, because that is its hour and it has been waiting. You do not have to argue with it. You do not have to make it smaller, and you do not have to decide tonight whether it is right. You only have to remain a separate object from it, the ordinary-sized person who is in this room, in this year, with something to do in the morning, and who is also carrying a very large thought. That person is not the enemy of the thought. That person is the only reason it is survivable. Put it in the chair by the bed, not answered, not dismissed. Just over there, in its own seat, where you can see it. One more thing, and then I will stop. You are not going to settle it tonight. Not the truth of it, and not your relationship to it. What you can do, lying here, is notice which of the two questions your mind is actually working on. If it is the first one, whether the thing is true, then you are engaged in an activity with no terminating condition at the worst hour of the day, with no new evidence available. If it is the second, whether there are two things in the room, that one takes about 4 seconds and you have already done it. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands be heavy, and your legs and the back of your head. Whatever it is can keep its seat. It does not have to be answered, and it does not have to be dismissed, and it does not have to be smaller than it is. It only has to stay over there. One last thing, and it is small. Nothing about tonight requires you to have an idea worth this much attention. Most people do not, most of the time, and the ones who do are not better off for it. If what you are carrying at this hour is not a large conviction, but simply a tired mind going round on something ordinary, the same 3 sentences apply, and the ordinary version resolves faster. Either way, it can wait. It has waited this long, and it is not going anywhere before morning. There is nothing further to work out tonight. Sleep now.